After my father-in-law's funeral, my unemployed husband inherited $210 million, then left me with a smug grin. "You're useless to me now," he snapped. "I don't need you anymore." But after the divorce filing, the lawyer just chuckled. "Did you actually read the will?" My ex-husband's face went ghost white when he saw the shocking truth. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. Now, let me take you into this story. "Finally, I don't need your pathetic salary anymore," Landon said. He tossed the key to our small Boston apartment onto the kitchen table, the metallic clatter sounding like a final, winning hand in a poker game he'd been playing all along. $90 million, Audrey. That's what Dad left me. Your little paychecks were useful for covering the rent, I'll give you that, but now," he shrugged, a theatrical display of indifference. "You serve no purpose." It had been exactly 36 hours since we buried Arthur, his father. Arthur, the kind, quiet man who had whispered strange last words to me, something about justice arriving in the most unexpected of ways. Now, as Landon pranced around our apartment, already planning his new life as a millionaire, my fingers nervously traced the edge of a business card in my pocket. It belonged to Arthur's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, and it came with an urgent voicemail I hadn't yet returned. "Mrs. Thompson," the deep, serious voice had said, "it is imperative that you attend the reading of the will. There is a contingency clause your husband is unaware of." Landon, oblivious, pulled a bottle of champagne from our refrigerator. It was a nice one, a bottle I had bought months ago for our anniversary, an anniversary he had completely forgotten. The pop of the cork echoed like a gunshot in our cramped one-bedroom apartment. He didn't offer me a glass. Instead, he took a long swig directly from the bottle while scrolling through real estate listings in Miami Beach on his phone. "I'm thinking South Beach," he mused, not even looking at me. "Maybe a penthouse, something with a private elevator." "You can keep this place," he added, gesturing vaguely at the apartment I had single-handedly paid for over the last 4 years. "Consider it severance pay. For your services." Services. For years of our marriage, reduced to a cold business transaction. For years of me waking up at dawn for my job as a financial analyst downtown while he slept until noon. For years of watching my savings account drain away to fund his endless string of failed business ventures. The gourmet food truck that never got the right permits. The revolutionary app that never launched. The consulting firm that never found a single client. It was all a blur of broken promises and depleted bank statements. Now, he was acting like he'd earned this fortune himself. I just stood there, watching him, a ghost in my own home, while he planned his grand escape. The silence in the apartment after Landon left was deafening. It felt bigger, emptier, like a valve had been released, letting out all the pressure that had been building for years. He packed a single, expensive-looking suitcase, one I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago, and announced he was staying at the Four Seasons until the inheritance paperwork was finalized. "I can't stand another night in this dump," were his parting words. A dump. The home I had carefully curated, the sanctuary I tried to build for us, the place his own father, Arthur, had visited every single Sunday until he got too sick. I walked into our bedroom. He'd left a pile of his old suits on the bed, clothes he now deemed unworthy of his new millionaire status. I started hanging them back up in the closet, my movements mechanical. I needed something to do, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. As I smoothed the lapel of a gray wool suit, a memory surfaced, so sharp it felt like it happened yesterday. It was about 6 months after we were married, and I was performing this exact same ritual, cleaning up after one of Landon's dramatic exits. That time, it was about his food truck venture. He'd spent weeks, not cooking or testing recipes, but creating elaborate spreadsheets. They were works of art, really, with color-coded projections showing profits that would triple in the first year. He'd even hired a graphic designer for promotional materials, for routes he would never drive, serving food he never learned how to make. The permits alone cost him $3,000. The industrial kitchen equipment rental was another $5,000. The custom-wrapped vehicle, his so-called mobile restaurant, was another $8,000, and it was sitting in a storage unit on the outskirts of Boston, collecting dust. Every single penny of it came from my savings, withdrawn in small enough amounts that I could lie to myself, convince myself they were investments in our future. The morning he finally admitted the permits had expired and used, he didn't apologize. He blamed the city of Boston. The bureaucracy in this city is designed to crush innovation, he declared, pacing our living room while I stared at the final notice from the storage facility. They don't want independent entrepreneurs to succeed. They want us all to be corporate drones. When I gently pointed out that thousands of food trucks operated successfully in the city, that maybe the issue was his complete lack of experience in the restaurant industry or a business plan beyond pretty spreadsheets, he looked at me with genuine hurt in his eyes. "I thought you believed in me," he'd whispered. And somehow, by the end of that conversation, I was the one apologizing, comforting him for a failure that had cost me over $16,000. That was the weekend Arthur started his Sunday visits. I was in the middle of this painful memory when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. "Thinking of you, sweetie. Call me when you can." I couldn't bring myself to reply just yet. What would I even say? My husband just left me because he thinks he's about to be rich? It sounded like a bad soap opera plot. I put the phone down and went back to the closet. The faint scent of Landon's cologne, a scent I used to love, now made my stomach turn. I felt a hot flash of anger crawl up my neck. All those years, all that support, all for nothing. He had used me. It was as simple and as ugly as that. But then I remembered the lawyer's voicemail. A contingency clause. What could it be? A small part of me, a part one hadn't realized was still capable of hope, started to wonder. Maybe Arthur, in his quiet wisdom, had seen this coming all along. I first met Landon at a networking event at the Seaport Hotel. The ballroom was buzzing with ambitious young professionals, all armed with business cards and practiced elevator pitches. My boss had insisted I go, saying it would be good for visibility. I remember standing by the bar, nursing a mediocre glass of white wine, when Landon materialized beside me. "You look like someone who actually has a real job," he said, flashing a smile that should have warned me it was a little too rehearsed. "I'm Landon Thompson," he said, extending a hand. "Currently between projects, but by choice, of course. I'm taking care of my father. He's not well." The story he spun that night was perfectly crafted to elicit sympathy. His mother had passed away young, his father was ill, and he had selflessly put a promising career on hold to be there for his family. In a room full of people bragging about their stock portfolios and profit margins, his tale of filial devotion stood out. When he remembered my name 3 hours later in a crowd of 50 people, when he brought me a fresh drink without being asked, when he perfectly repeated back something I'd said about market volatility, I thought I'd found someone who actually listened. He seemed different. "My dad built half the shopping centers in Massachusetts," he told me over coffee the next morning, "but I learned early on that money isn't everything. When someone needs you, you have to show up." I was 35 at the time, 2 years out from a divorce that had been less of an explosion and more of a slow leak, a gradual loss of air until we were both just empty. My ex-husband and I had simply drifted apart, two parallel lines that never fought, but also never touched. Landon's energy, his confidence, the way he made even unemployment sound strategic and noble, it brought color back into my gray, predictable world. I was so ready to believe in him. Now, standing in the silence of my apartment, I saw the whole thing for what it was, a performance. A long, carefully executed con. The devoted son, the brilliant entrepreneur in waiting, it was all a role he played. And I had been his most captive audience. I walked over to the window and looked down at the Boston streets. People were hurrying home from work, living their normal lives. My own life felt like it had just been detonated. The shock was starting to wear off, replaced by a cold, hard knot of anger in my stomach. I thought about Arthur. I remembered the first time I met him, 6 months into my relationship with Landon. Landon had finally invited me over for dinner. The apartment in Beacon Hill wasn't what I expected from his descriptions of his family's wealth. It was comfortable, but modest, filled with books instead of status symbols, a place of wisdom rather than ostentation. Arthur was 78 then, but his mind was as sharp as someone half his age. Within minutes of sitting down, he was asking me real questions about my work. Not the usual polite, surface-level inquiries. "Financial analyst," he'd said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Tell me, what are your thoughts on the Federal Reserve's current interest rate policy?" We talked for 2 hours about market dynamics while Landon sat between us, growing visibly bored, scrolling on his phone and occasionally throwing out buzzwords like disruption that had nothing to do with our conversation. At one point, while Landon was refilling our wine glasses, Arthur leaned in close to me. "My son," he said softly, "he needs an anchor. Someone who understands that wealth without wisdom is just expensive foolishness. I hope you're that person. But more importantly, I hope you protect yourself, too." The warning was there, wrapped in paternal concern. I had chosen to hear only the hope. A year later, Arthur insisted on paying for our small wedding, over Landon's protests. Landon wanted to invite what he called potential investors, people whose business cards he'd collected, who might be impressed by a lavish reception. Arthur had quietly but firmly vetoed that plan. 20 guests, simple flowers, a modest reception at a local restaurant. "A marriage is not a networking event, Landon," Arthur had said. And Landon had sulked for weeks. During the ceremony, as Landon delivered a toast that sounded more like a business pitch than a declaration of love, Arthur had slipped an envelope into my hand. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note, "For the emergencies I suspect are coming. Remember, wisdom matters more than wealth." My mother, who had flown in from Chicago, had watched the whole thing with worried eyes. "Are you sure about this one?" she had whispered to me during the reception. I was sure then. I was so wrong. "Are you just going to stand there all day?" Landon's voice boomed from the living room, startling me out of my memories. "Oh, right." This was from before he left for the hotel. My mind was jumping around, trying to piece everything together. He had finished half the bottle of champagne by then and was now pulling suits from our closet, tossing the ones he considered unworthy of his new millionaire status onto the bed. "Mr. Sterling says the probate should be finalized tomorrow. I'll have the divorce papers ready to go by then." Mr. Sterling. Arthur's lawyer. The man whose business card felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. The same Mr. Sterling who had left me that voicemail just hours after the funeral. "Mrs. Thompson, it is essential that you attend the reading of the will. There are aspects of Arthur's estate that require your presence. Please, call me immediately." Landon hadn't mentioned a formal reading of the will. According to him, it was all a done deal, a straightforward inheritance guaranteed to him. But Arthur had been many things, generous, wise, patient with his disappointing son, but he had never been straightforward about anything important. "I'm checking into the Four Seasons tonight," Landon announced, zipping up the suitcase I'd bought him. "I can't stand another night in this dump." A dump. This apartment, where I had paid the rent for 4 years. This was the place Arthur had come every Sunday until he fell ill, always bringing groceries he claimed were extras, always slipping cash into my purse when Landon wasn't looking, always staying for coffee and conversation after his son inevitably disappeared to network at sports bars. As Landon headed for the door, dragging his suitcase behind him, he paused. "Oh, and Audrey," he said, turning back with that smug smile. "Don't try to contest anything. Dad told me years ago I was his sole beneficiary. The full $190 million, it's all mine." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the apartment that suddenly felt vast, empty, but somehow less suffocating. I pulled out Mr. Sterling's card and my phone. Whatever Arthur had planned, whatever he had whispered about justice with his dying breath, I was about to find out. The phone rang once before Mr. Sterling answered as if he'd been waiting. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite interpret. We need to talk about Arthur's will. Can you be at my office tomorrow morning? And please, come alone. Do not mention this to Landon. The morning after Landon admitted the food truck permits had expired, Arthur showed up for what would become his first Sunday visit. He arrived at our door with 2 bags of groceries, claiming he'd overbought for one person. Landon barely looked up from his laptop, where he was already researching his next venture, something about a revolutionary app that would disrupt the grocery delivery market. Let me help you with those, Arthur said to me. And as we unpacked vegetables, milk, and bread that I hadn't asked for but desperately needed, he discreetly slipped an envelope into my purse on the counter. Later, I found $500 in cash inside with a note that just said, for groceries. Don't be proud. Those Sunday visits became the rhythm that kept me sane. Arthur would arrive at 10 a.m., always with food, always with an excuse about buying too much or finding a great sale. Landon would tolerate his father's presence for about 30 minutes before announcing he had to meet with potential investors, which we both knew meant watching football at the Irish pub 3 blocks away. Once Landon was gone, Arthur would make real coffee, not the instant kind I had switched to for budget reasons, and we would sit at the small kitchen table and talk about everything except his son's failures. He taught me about dividend investing, about the power of compound interest, about financial strategies I already knew from my job but which took on new meaning discussing them with someone who had actually built a fortune instead of just analyzing them. You have a gift for understanding money, he told me once. I'm afraid Landon never inherited that particular gene. It was during one of those Sunday conversations, about a year into our marriage, that I found the credit card statements. I was looking for a pen in Landon's briefcase, an expensive leather one he carried everywhere, despite having no business to conduct, when a few folded papers fell out. 3 months of statements for a credit card I never knew existed. The charges made my stomach clench. P1 nightclub, $1,200. Tantris restaurant, $800 for a business dinner on a Tuesday when he'd told me he was at a startup meeting. Custom suits from a boutique on Newbury Street, tailored shirts, shoes that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. All of it was labeled business expenses in his careful handwriting in the margins, as if writing the words made them true. I confronted him that night, the statements spread across our bed like evidence at a trial. He looked at them with the detached air of someone reviewing someone else's problems. You don't understand how the business world works, Audrey, he said, straightening the collar of his shirt, one of the new ones, I now realized. These aren't expenses, they're investments. The people I meet with, the contacts I make, they expect a certain presentation. Do you think Mark Zuckerberg wore a cheap suit when he was raising capital? Mark Zuckerberg is famous for wearing the same gray t-shirt every day, I shot back, and for a moment, his composure cracked. That's because he's already made it, he recovered quickly. I'm still on the climb. And if you can't support that climb, if you can't believe in the vision, then maybe you're the problem. The fight that followed was the worst we'd ever had. We raised our voices so loud our neighbor knocked on the wall. Landon stormed out, and I locked myself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor, crying silently so he wouldn't hear me if he came back. Through the door, I could hear him in the living room. Not pacing, not remorseful, but the sounds of a video game starting up, gunshots and explosions covering the silence between us. The next morning, Arthur arrived for his usual Sunday visit and found me red-eyed and exhausted. Landon was already gone for his networking. Arthur just looked at me, pulled me into a hug that smelled of old-fashioned aftershave and safety, and asked quietly, how much? I don't know. Maybe $20,000 in total? Maybe more, I confessed, the shame washing over me. He wrote me a check for $5,000 on the spot, insisting it was an early birthday present, even though my birthday was 4 months away. Then he sat down heavily, looking every one of his 79 years. His mother left when he was 15, Arthur said, staring into his coffee. She said she couldn't take the lies anymore. They weren't big lies, just constant small ones. Where he'd been, what he'd spent the money on, who he'd talked to. Stories that didn't need to be stories. I thought it was teenage rebellion, that he'd grow out of it. He paused, and I could see him wrestling with how much to share, how much truth about his son I could bear. I blamed myself. After she left, I gave him everything, trying to fill that void. Private schools, cars, cash whenever he asked. I thought I was showing him love, but I was just teaching him that there would always be someone to clean up his messes. We sat in silence for a long time. The weight of his confession settled between us, another presence in the room. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes reflecting decades of disappointment. "I won't tell you to leave him," he said. "But I need you to know that I'll understand if you do. And if you stay, we protect each other from the worst of it." That became our unspoken agreement. Arthur would help me financially when he could, and I would shield him from the full extent of Landon's failures. We never spoke of the money that passed between us. We never acknowledged the elaborate fictions we maintained. When Landon would brag to his father about a new client or a successful meeting, we would both just nod along. When he disappeared for hours on mysterious business, we pretended not to notice the lingering smell of bar smoke on his clothes. But I knew Arthur saw it all, with his quiet, watchful eyes. He was documenting his son's lies, observing the patterns, waiting for something I didn't yet understand. The understanding that passed between Arthur and me that Sunday morning became the foundation of something I never expected, a friendship built on shared disappointment and mutual protection. We never spoke directly of Landon's lies again, but the silence between us was filled with unspoken truths. Arthur would slip cash into my purse, and I would pretend not to notice the bills accumulating, and together we maintained the fiction that Landon was just one big break away from success. 18 months into this careful dance, everything changed with a single phone call. I was in a client meeting downtown when my phone vibrated with an unknown number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me excuse myself and answer. "Is this Audrey Thompson?" The voice belonged to an older woman, flustered and formal. "This is Mrs. Chin, Arthur's neighbor. I found him on the stairs this morning. He seemed dizzy, confused. The paramedics are taking him to Mass General." The meeting dissolved into a blur of hasty apologies and gathered belongings. I called Landon 7 times on the way to the hospital. Every call went straight to voicemail. When I finally reached him, he was at a golf course in Chestnut Hill, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses in the background. "Dad fell? Is he okay?" His voice conveyed the appropriate amount of concern, but I could hear the underlying calculation, the mental math of how this might affect him. Arthur was sitting up in his hospital bed when I arrived, annoyed by all the fuss. The doctor explained it was a mild case of vertigo, complicated by dehydration. Nothing life-threatening, but at his age, living alone was becoming a risk. Arthur waved off the concerns, insisting he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself. But I saw the slight tremor in his hands, the way he gripped the bed rail when he thought no one was looking. Landon arrived 3 hours later, still in his golf attire, and delivered what might have been the performance of his life. He took his father's hand, his eyes welling up with tears, and announced with great solemnity that he was abandoning his current business venture to become Arthur's full-time caregiver. "Dad, you've given me everything," he said, loud enough for the nurses to overhear. "Now it's my turn. I'm moving back home. I'll take care of you. That's what family does." Arthur looked at me over Landon's bowed head, and I saw resignation mixed with something else, maybe a flicker of hope that this crisis would finally be the thing to change his son. I wanted to share that hope, but the speech sounded too polished, too perfect, as if Landon had rehearsed it on the drive over. For exactly 1 week, Landon played the part of the devoted son. He moved a few items of clothing into Arthur's apartment and posted pictures on social media of himself making breakfast for his dad, making sure everyone knew the sacrifice he was making. On the 8th day, I came home early from work with a migraine and saw something that instantly made my headache worse. A woman in navy blue scrubs was leaving our building, looking at her phone as she walked to a car parked outside. She looked professional, competent, the kind of private nurse that costs several $100s a day. I watched her drive away, then went upstairs and found Landon on our couch, playing online poker on his laptop. "How's your dad?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. He's good. Just left him for his nap. Made him lunch and everything." The lie slid out so easily, so naturally, that if I hadn't seen the nurse myself, I would have believed him. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I went through Landon's email while he was asleep. I found the correspondence with a home care agency. He had hired them the day after his grand announcement, billing the 24-hour care directly to Arthur's accounts, all while telling his father he was doing it all himself. The worst part was an email where Landon instructed the agency to have their nurses wear plain clothes when entering and leaving the building to maintain discretion. The invoices were astronomical, $4,000 a week for care Landon was taking credit for. Meanwhile, he was spending maybe an hour a day with Arthur, usually around lunchtime, posting a photo to keep up the illusion. The rest of his time was spent spending money with an urgency that terrified me. Designer clothes started appearing in our closet, the tags carefully removed but the receipts tucked away in jacket pockets. A Tag Heuer watch appeared on his wrist, a gift, he claimed, from a grateful business contact. When I asked about a $3,000 charge on our credit card, he spun an elaborate tale about an investor paying him in cash, money he'd used to pay off the card before interest could accrue. Besides, he said, examining his new watch, Dad's not going to be around forever. When the inheritance comes through, $3,000 will be nothing. We're just borrowing against our future. Our future. As if I hadn't noticed him browsing properties in Miami Beach. As if I hadn't seen the texts to his old college buddies about how he was soon to be single again. As if I was too stupid to realize he was already replacing me with the promise of money that didn't even exist yet. The next 2 months passed in a haze of Landon's increasingly frequent shopping sprees and Arthur's deteriorating health. The vertigo had been a warning sign of more serious problems. His heart was failing, slowly but steadily. The man who once spent hours debating market strategies with me could now barely stay awake through a short visit. Landon would sit by his father's bedside, staring at his phone, occasionally looking up to pat Arthur's hand when a nurse walked by. It was during one of those visits, on what would be Arthur's last lucid day, that everything came into focus. Landon had stepped out to take a call, another fictitious investor, another imaginary deal, leaving Arthur and me alone. His grip on my hand was surprisingly strong, urgent. "Audrey," he whispered, his voice raspy but clear. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," I said, leaning closer. "The reading of the will. When I'm gone, you have to be there. No matter what Landon says, no matter what excuse he makes. Promise me." "I promise, but Arthur. Mr. Sterling, my lawyer, has his instructions. It's all taken care of." His eyes, clouded with medication and pain, suddenly sharpened. "I know about the nurse, Audrey. I've always known. Just like I know about the credit cards, the lies, all of it." My face must have shown my shock because he squeezed my hand gently. "A father knows his son," he said. "But sometimes, wisdom matters more than blood. Remember that. Wisdom matters more than wealth, more than anything." He fumbled on the bedside table and produced a small leather-bound journal, its cover soft with age. Inside the cover, in a shaky hand, he had written, "For Audrey's thoughts, and for the truth, when the time comes." "Keep this," he said. "Write everything down. The truth, not the story Landon tells. Someone has to remember what really happened." Landon returned then, slipping his phone into his pocket with the self-satisfied look of someone who had just sold another lie. He glanced at his father, then at his watch, that expensive watch that couldn't buy him a conscience. "Dad looks tired," he announced. "We should go." "The nurse will be here soon," he caught himself quickly, adding, I'll be back tonight to check on him." Arthur closed his eyes, but he didn't let go of my hand. "Remember your promise," he whispered, so low that Landon didn't hear. 3 days later, Arthur died in his sleep, finally free from both his failing heart and his failing son. Landon was at a bar when it happened, celebrating a deal that didn't exist with money he didn't yet have. I was the one who got the call. I was the one who sat with Arthur's body until the funeral home arrived. I was the one who truly mourned him. The funeral home attendant helped me gather Arthur's personal effects from the hospital room while Landon waited in the car, engine running. His reading glasses were folded on the bedside table, next to the leather journal he'd given me. The nurse who was on duty when Arthur passed touched my shoulder gently. She whispered that he'd gone peacefully at 5:47 a.m., no pain, just a quiet fading, like someone finally allowed to rest. Landon had received the call at 6 a.m. By 6:15, he was already texting someone about meeting for drinks to celebrate a business opportunity. The drive home from the hospital was long, stretched out by morning traffic, giving me too much time to watch Landon's transformation. His eyes were still red when we left the parking garage, but by the time we hit the freeway, he was dictating voice memos about asset liquidation and researching the tax implications of large inheritances. At a red light, I saw him type Waterfront Properties Miami Beach over $5 million into his phone's browser. Arthur's body was still warm, and his son was already spending money that existed only in his imagination. "We need to call Albrecht's funeral home," I said, breaking the silence. "Your father mentioned once that he wanted." "Whatever's quickest," Landon cut me off, aggressively merging into the left lane. "Simple service, quick burial." Dad wasn't one for fuss. In reality, Arthur had told me he wanted his book club friends to read passages from his favorite novels at the funeral. He wanted jazz music because it reminded him of his youth. He hoped people would share stories over good wine and remember his laughter. None of that mattered to Landon, who saw his father's death as an inconvenient delay before his payday. When we got back to our apartment, Landon was already on the phone with 3 different real estate agents in Miami. He had a call scheduled with a succession lawyer he'd found online and was browsing Lamborghini dealerships. I sat at the kitchen table and started calling Arthur's friends from the numbers in his address book while Landon paced behind me, having loud conversations about investment opportunities and portfolio diversification with people who didn't yet know he had no money to invest. The funeral took place 2 days later at a chapel in Brookline that Landon had chosen because they offered an all-inclusive package. The February rain had turned the cemetery into a field of mud that clung to our shoes as we walked to the gravesite. Landon insisted on giving the eulogy. He'd pulled up a template on his phone in the car and literally read from the screen at the podium. "Arthur was a loving father who taught me everything I know about business," he said, which was technically true, since Arthur had taught him nothing and he knew nothing. "He lived a full life and leaves behind a legacy of success." Generic words that could apply to anyone's father, delivered with all the emotion of a weather report. During the burial, as the pastor spoke of dust to dust and eternal rest, Landon stood beside me, checking his phone every 30 seconds. I watched him type with one hand while holding a black umbrella with the other, tilting it to shield the screen from the rain, but not the casket. Apparently, the probate lawyer had texted him about the timeline for the inheritance, and that was more important than watching his father be lowered into the earth. The reception afterward revealed everything I had been too blind to see. Arthur's book club friends, kind people in their 70s and 80s who had known him for decades, formed a protective circle around me while actively avoiding Landon. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had led their discussions on Hemingway and Faulkner, pulled me aside near the coffee urn. "Arthur was so worried about you, dear," she said softly, her warm hand on mine. "He made us promise we'd look after you, after everything settled down." "After what settled down?" I asked, but she just squeezed my hand and moved away as Landon approached, his fake smile preceding him like a warning. "Good turnout," he said, even though fewer than 20 people had come. "Dad would be proud." He glanced at his watch, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. "How much longer do we have to stay here?" We left an hour later, Landon complaining about the waste of time while I sat silently in the passenger seat, holding a cardboard box of Arthur's books that Mrs. Rodriguez had insisted I take. "He would want you to have them," she'd said, and something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was letting on. That night, Landon opened the expensive bottle of champagne he'd been saving. To new beginnings, he toasted, by himself, since I hadn't taken a glass. He drank nearly the whole bottle while browsing yacht listings on his laptop, occasionally reading prices aloud as if he were choosing from a restaurant menu. I went to bed, exhausted by grief and the sheer effort of pretending Landon's behavior wasn't appalling, but I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, listening to him on the phone in the living room, his voice growing louder as the champagne took effect, making promises about investments and partnerships that would materialize once his funds cleared. The morning after the funeral, I woke up to find Landon already awake, dressed in his best suit, papers spread all over the kitchen table. My black funeral dress was still hanging on the back of the bathroom door where I'd left it. I hadn't even had coffee when he began his presentation. $190 million, he announced, standing as if addressing a board meeting. That's what Dad's estate is worth. I've already spoken with Daniel Sterling, Dad's lawyer. Probate should clear in a few days. He slid the divorce papers across the table with the casual efficiency of someone closing a business deal. Finally, I don't need your pathetic salary anymore. It was useful for paying the rent, but now. He shrugged, you serve no purpose. Those words should have shattered me. They should have made me crumble, cry, beg. Instead, I felt something else entirely, a cold clarity, like ice water in my veins. Arthur's voice echoed in my memory. Wisdom matters more than wealth. The leather journal he'd given me was in my purse, and tucked inside it was Mr. Sterling's business card, with that urgent voicemail I still hadn't returned. Fine, I heard myself say, my voice steady as I took the pen Landon offered. But I want it done properly, through lawyers. Whatever makes you feel better, Landon chuckled, already mentally decorating his Miami penthouse. Sterling will handle everything. The inheritance, the divorce, all of it. A clean break. I signed my name with deliberate care, each letter a small goodbye to the life I had tried to build with someone incapable of building anything. Landon snatched the papers back with a grin so wide it looked painful. You can keep this dump, he said, gesturing at our apartment with disdain. Consider it a severance package. 20 minutes later, I was in our bedroom, packing a single bag, choosing only the essentials. Landon's celebratory phone calls echoed from the living room, friends, acquaintances, anyone who would listen to his grandiose plans. I'm thinking of starting a hedge fund, I heard him say. With a couple $100 million in capital, I could really make a splash. The elevator in our building took forever, giving me too much time to think. But I wasn't thinking about Landon, or the divorce, or even the money. I was thinking about Arthur's handshake, surprisingly strong for a dying man. His insistence that I attend the will reading. The meaningful looks and careful words from Mrs. Rodriguez. The urgent voicemail from Daniel Sterling that Landon knew nothing about. The taxi driver who picked me up outside watched me in the rearview mirror as I sat clutching my bag like a life raft. You okay, ma'am? He asked kindly. Tough morning? I'm about to find out, I replied, pulling out my phone to finally return Mr. Sterling's call. The phone rang twice before Daniel Sterling answered, his voice professional but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. Mrs. Thompson. I was expecting your call. Are you somewhere private where we can speak? The taxi had just pulled up in front of a Marriott near the airport, far enough away from our apartment in the South End that Landon wouldn't stumble upon me by chance. I asked the driver to wait while I finished the call, watching planes take off into the gray February morning, each one carrying people to new lives while mine hung suspended between what was and what might be. Mr. Sterling, I began, your voicemail mentioned the reading of the will. Landon said it was all straightforward. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of shuffling papers. Mrs. Thompson, your husband has made several assumptions about his father's estate. Arthur was very specific in his instructions. Both you and Landon must attend the formal reading. Are you available tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Landon mentioned the inheritance is worth $190 million, I said, needing to understand what game was being played. The gross value of the estate is indeed substantial, Mr. Sterling replied cautiously, measuring each word like an ingredient in a delicate recipe. However, Arthur was very specific about the conditions of its distribution. I can't say more until the formal reading, but I strongly advise you to attend. Arthur insisted on it. After confirming I would be there, I paid the taxi driver and checked into the hotel using a credit card Landon didn't know about, one I'd kept for emergencies ever since my first marriage. The room was blandly corporate. Beige walls, blackout curtains, a bed that looked identical to thousands of others across the country. It felt appropriate, this neutral space between my old life and whatever was coming next. For the first time in 3 years, I called in sick to work. My supervisor, Janet, sounded genuinely concerned. Audrey, you haven't missed a single day since you started. Is everything all right? Family emergency, I said, which was true enough. I just need a few days to sort some things out. That afternoon, I ordered room service, a club sandwich that might as well have been cardboard for all I could taste. The TV played CNN on mute while I scrolled through apartment listings on my laptop, trying to imagine starting over at 38 with whatever was left after Landon's financial devastation. Studios in Alston, one-bedrooms in Somerville, places with rattling radiators and thin walls, but where the rent was manageable on a single salary. That night, as I was unpacking the single bag I'd hastily filled, I found Arthur's leather journal at the bottom, wrapped in one of my sweaters. Tucked inside the front cover, beneath his dedication to me, was an envelope I hadn't seen before. My name was written on it in Arthur's shaky script, dated exactly 1 month before his death. The letter inside was several pages long, written in bursts as his strength allowed, the handwriting growing weaker toward the end. My dearest Audrey, it began. If you are reading this, then things have transpired as I feared. First, I owe you an apology. I knew who Landon was when you married him. I had hoped, prayed, that your influence might change him. Instead, he simply used your goodness as another resource to exploit. I had to put the letter down, my hands trembling. Outside, the planes continued their ascent, lights blinking against the dusky evening sky. After a moment, I continued reading. Landon has always been this way. His mother, God rest her soul, left when she could no longer bear his lies. I blamed myself. I tried to make up for it with money, with things, with endless second chances. Each time, I only made him worse. You once asked me why I lived so modestly despite my wealth. The truth is, I have been protecting that wealth from my own son for years, knowing you would destroy it. The next paragraph took my breath away. I have made provisions in my will that Landon is unaware of. He has never read it, despite my attempts to discuss it with him. He assumes, as he always does, that everything will simply come to him. Daniel Sterling has my full instructions. Trust him. Attend the reading, no matter what Landon says or does. Justice has a way of arriving in unexpected packages. The letter concluded with words that made me cry more than I thought possible. You deserved better than the hand you were dealt. Marrying you is the only smart decision Landon ever made, though he will never understand why. Be strong, my dear. What is coming will be difficult, but necessary. And please, do not blame yourself for any of this. There are people you cannot save, you can only survive them. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the journal. My phone, which I'd put on silent, showed 17 missed calls from Landon and dozens of texts. The progression was almost comical in its predictability. First, the demands, "Where are you? This is ridiculous." Then, the anger, "You can't just disappear like this. We have things to discuss." Followed by faux concern, "I'm worried about you. Just let me know you're okay." Then, the manipulation, "We can work this out." Maybe I was hasty. Back to anger, "You're being childish. Grow up." Next, the threats, "I'll take everything in the divorce. You'll get nothing." And finally, malicious glee, "Probate clears tomorrow. Thanks for making this easier by leaving." By the way, it was very generous of me to let you keep the apartment. You should be grateful. I didn't answer a single one. I let him believe he had one, that I had simply run away, defeated. The truth would come out soon enough, wrapped in legal language and witnessed by the professional presence of Daniel Sterling. That night, lying in the hotel bed, I stared at the ceiling. The city lights filtered through the gap in the curtains, creating shifting patterns with each passing car. Somewhere across Boston, Landon was probably celebrating his imaginary fortune, running up tabs he couldn't pay, making promises he couldn't keep. The thought should have given me some satisfaction, but all I felt was tired. A deep, bone-weary, soul-deep exhaustion from years of propping up someone who confused taking with earning. The next day, I forced myself to eat breakfast in the hotel lobby, surrounded by business travelers checking their emails and families heading to the airport. Normal people, living normal lives, unaware that at the table next to them sat a woman whose entire existence had been blown apart and was about to be reformed in the span of 72 hours. I spent the afternoon in the hotel's business center, updating my resume and researching market salaries for financial analysts. If I got nothing else from Arthur's mysterious provisions, I could at least rebuild my career without Landon draining every paycheck. The third morning dawned gray and bitterly cold, perfect weather for revelations. Mr. Sterling called at 8 a.m. to confirm the meeting. Both parties have confirmed their attendance, he said formally. I want to prepare you, this may be emotionally difficult. Arthur anticipated several reactions. Is Landon getting his $190 million? I asked directly. Mr. Sterling's pause was eloquent. Mr. Thompson will be receiving exactly what his father intended for him to receive, under the conditions Arthur set forth. No more, and no less. I chose my outfit carefully. Professional black trousers, a simple gray blazer, the uniform of someone with nothing to prove and nothing to hide. The woman in the hotel mirror looked older than 38, but stronger somehow, as if the pressure had compressed her into something harder, more valuable. The elevator in Mr. Sterling's downtown office building climbed 23 floors as I studied my reflection in its polished brass doors. The professional woman staring back looked serene, but inside, my pulse was hammering with anticipation. I stepped out into a reception area that reeked of old money, dark wood paneling, leather chairs that had held secrets for decades, oil paintings of the Boston skyline before glass towers took over. Landon was already there, lounging in one of those leather armchairs like he owned the place. The new suit he was wearing still had the subtle sheen of new fabric, likely bought yesterday on a credit card he couldn't afford to pay off. A fake Rolex, I could tell by the way the second hand ticked instead of sweeping, adorned his wrist. He didn't look up from his phone when I walked in, his thumbs flying across the screen as he typed what were undoubtedly more promises about investments he would soon be making. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, the receptionist announced, Mr. Sterling will see you now. Only then did Landon acknowledge my presence, his eyes sliding over me with dismissive calculation. I was wearing the same dark gray blazer I'd worn to a dozen client meetings, the same practical trousers, the same modest watch Arthur had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. Next to Landon's desperate display of imaginary wealth, I looked exactly like what I was, someone who worked for a living. Mr. Sterling's office occupied a corner of the building, with windows on two sides offering a view of the Charles River snaking through the city like a gray ribbon. The man himself stood as we entered, his silver hair and quiet dignity making Landon's flashy suit look even more like a costume. His desk, a massive piece of mahogany that could have served as a dining table, dominated the room. Please, have a seat, Mr. Sterling said, gesturing to 2 chairs placed side by side in front of his desk. Landon immediately made a show of moving his chair a few inches away from mine, as if my proximity might somehow contaminate his impending fortune. Mr. Sterling observed this petty performance with an unreadable expression, then settled into his own chair with the careful movements of a man who has all the time in the world. Before we begin, Mr. Sterling said, pulling a thick folder from his desk drawer, I need to confirm a few details. Landon, you filed for divorce from Audrey 3 days ago. Is that correct? Landon waved his hand impatiently. Yes, it's all filed. Can we just get to the inheritance distribution? I have appointments this afternoon. No, he didn't, but the lie came as naturally to him as breathing. And you have both signed the papers, Mr. Sterling continued, his tone perfectly neutral. Signed and submitted, Landon confirmed, leaning forward eagerly. Now, about the $190 million. Have you read your father's will, Landon? Mr. Sterling interrupted, and the question dropped into the room like a stone in still water. Landon's enthusiasm faltered. Dad told me years ago. I'm the sole beneficiary. I asked if you have read the will, Mr. Sterling repeated, sliding the folder across the mahogany surface with deliberate precision. The document itself. Not what you recall from conversations. I watched Landon's face shift from irritation to uncertainty. His hand hesitated before reaching for the folder, and I saw the corner of Mr. Sterling's mouth twitch in what might have been the faintest hint of a smile. Landon opened the folder with the confidence of someone about to confirm what he already knows. I watched his eyes scan the first page, the legal boilerplate establishing Arthur's identity, his soundness of mind, the date the will was last revised, just 1 month before his death. Landon frowned slightly, probably wondering why his father had updated it so recently, but he read on. It was on the second page where everything changed. I could track his progress by the way his face transformed. First, confusion, as he encountered the language about contingencies and conditions. Then, disbelief, as he reached the marital clause, the requirement that he remain married to me for 1 full year after Arthur's death to inherit the entirety of the estate. His hands began to tremble as he found the next section, the one detailing the charitable trust for financial education that would receive the bulk of the estate if the marital condition was not met. This can't be right, Landon whispered, his voice barely audible. There must be a mistake. There is no mistake, Mr. Sterling said calmly. Your father was very specific. The full inheritance of $190 million was contingent upon you maintaining your marriage to Audrey. He believed, and I quote, that Landon needs Audrey's wisdom and stability to handle such wealth responsibly. Landon's face had gone so pale his spray tan looked orange in the morning light streaming through the windows. But I filed for divorce. We can stop it. We can withdraw the papers. He turned to me, his eyes wild with panic. Audrey, we can fix this. Just tell him we've reconciled. Mr. Sterling continued as if Landon hadn't spoken. As per the terms, in the event that you initiate divorce proceedings within 1 year of Arthur's death, the entire estate is to be transferred to the Harbor Light Foundation for Financial Literacy, -1 small, personal stipend. How small? Landon asked, his voice cracking. $50,000, Mr. Sterling replied. Your father felt it was, and I quote, enough for Landon to get a fresh start and hopefully learn the value of work and loyalty. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the city noise from 23 floors below seemed to have stopped. Landon just stared at the will, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he glared at them long enough. Suddenly, his new suit seemed to hang off his shoulders, like a boy playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Then came the bargaining. Audrey, please, Landon said, turning to me for the first time since he'd entered the office. We can fix this. I was hasty. I was emotional, from the grief. We don't have to go through with the divorce. I just stared at him. You told me I was useless to you, I said, my voice flat. I didn't mean it. I was upset about Dad. You know how grief makes people act. You were Googling waterfront properties in Miami before his body was cold. Landon's tactics shifted rapidly, running through every manipulation he had ever used. First came the promises. We can split it. $95 million each. More money than either of us could ever spend. Then, the rationalization. Dad would want us to work it out. He loved us both. Followed by threats. I'll contest the will. This is undue influence. You poisoned him against me. And finally, tears. Real tears, which might have moved me if I hadn't seen him practice crying in the bathroom mirror before meetings with investors. "Landon," I said, my voice as calm as I'd ever heard it, the kind of calm you feel when you've moved past anger into something clearer. "You spent 4 years living off my salary while you played pretend entrepreneur. You lied to your dying father, telling him you were caring for him while you hired a nurse with his own money. You counted down the days he had left like it was an advent calendar filled with $100 bills. And the second you thought you didn't need me, you threw me away." I stood up, smoothing down my trousers, and looked at the man I once thought I could save with enough patience and support. "Your father knew exactly who you were. That's why he set up these conditions. He wanted to teach you one last lesson about the value of loyalty and honest work." I turned to Mr. Sterling. "Please, proceed with the divorce as requested. I think Arthur would like to know his fortune is going to help thousands of people learn financial literacy, something his own son never bothered to acquire." Landon's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally, a kind of broken desperation that might have been the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in years. And as I watched the man I married crumble before my eyes, the man who had called me useless just 48 hours earlier, I knew, deep in my bones, that I had made the right choice. If you're still listening, please help me out by liking this video and commenting the number 1 down below. It lets me know you gave me a like, and it tells me you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a huge encouragement for me to keep going. Just comment the number 1 and listen to me tell you the rest of my story. Landon's broken desperation hung in the air for only a moment before it curdled into something uglier. He shot to his feet, sending the heavy leather chair spinning behind him, and pointed an accusing finger at me. "You planned this. You and Dad, you conspired against me. You turned him against his own son." His voice rose with each word, echoing off the wood-paneled walls of the law office. Mr. Sterling remained seated, as calm as a lake while Landon raged like a storm above him. I simply stood my ground, watching as the man I had married peeled back every last layer of entitlement and delusion he had so carefully hidden behind his charm and false promises. "Mr. Thompson," Mr. Sterling said, his voice quiet but firm, "I can assure you, your father's will was drafted entirely at his own discretion. Mrs. Thompson had no knowledge of its contents until this moment." "That's impossible." Landon slammed his hand on the mahogany desk, making a crystal paperweight jump. "She must have manipulated him. He was sick, he was vulnerable. This is undue influence, elder abuse, something." Mr. Sterling opened another folder and produced several documents bearing official-looking seals. "Your father updated his will multiple times over the last 5 years, adding more specific conditions regarding your inheritance with each version. He met with me monthly while in perfect mental health. We have medical evaluations, witness statements, and video recordings of every session where he explicitly laid out his reasoning." "Video recordings?" Landon's rage faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Your father insisted on documenting everything. He anticipated you might contest the will." Mr. Sterling picked up a tablet and swiped to a file dated 6 weeks before Arthur's death. "Would you like to see your father explain, in his own words, why he structured his estate this way?" Landon sank back into his chair as if Mr. Sterling had pulled a gun instead of a tablet. "No. That's not necessary." But Mr. Sterling continued, relentless in his professional courtesy. "There is more you need to understand about the distribution. The $50,000 designated for you is not freely accessible. Your father placed it in a trust with specific conditions." "What conditions?" Landon's voice was now a choked whisper. "You must provide proof of employment to access the funds. Full-time employment, held for at least 6 months. The trust will release $10,000 upon proof of hiring, and the remaining $40,000 after 6 months of verified employment." Landon let out a laugh, but it sounded more like a sob. "He's trying to control me from the grave. He's trying to teach you what he couldn't in life," I said softly, speaking for the first time since I'd stood to leave. Landon turned on me again, but this time his anger was laced with a desperate, cruel edge. You think you've won something here? You get nothing, either. You heard him. The money goes to some charity, not you. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. Actually, that is not entirely accurate, Mr. Thompson. There is a separate provision for Mrs. Thompson. He produced another document. Arthur left her a personal bequest of $25,000, along with this note. He handed me an envelope with my name in Arthur's familiar script. Inside was a short message. For the new beginning you deserve, and for the kindness you showed an old man who didn't deserve it. Use it to build the life Landon could never give you. $25,000. It wasn't a life-changing amount of money, but it was enough. Enough to get a new apartment, to pay off the credit cards Landon had maxed out, maybe even take a vacation somewhere warm where I could remember what it felt like to relax. This is insane, Landon muttered, running his hands through his carefully styled hair, messing it up. $190 million. And it's all going to strangers because I filed for divorce 3 days too soon. Not strangers, Mr. Sterling corrected. To the Harbor Light Foundation for Financial Literacy. Your father served on several nonprofit boards and handpicked the trustees for this foundation. They are educators, social workers, and financial advisors who will use the funds to teach practical money management to underserved communities. Your father considered it his true legacy. Landon's face contorted as the full weight of his situation landed on him. I have nothing, he breathed. No job, no savings, no apartment. I spent everything I had because I thought. He trailed off, unable to admit he had been counting his father's money before they had even put him in the ground. You have $50,000 waiting for you once you get a job, Mr. Sterling reminded him. That is more than many people have to start over. I'm 41 years old. Landon's voice cracked again, rising toward hysteria. I haven't had a real job in 3 years. Who's going to hire me? For what? His shouting had reached a pitch that made Mr. Sterling discreetly press a button under his desk. Within seconds, a security guard appeared at the doorway, a silent but unmistakable presence. And that was it. That was the end. I turned, gave Mr. Sterling a small, grateful nod, and walked out of the office, leaving Landon alone with the ruins of the life he thought he was owed. I didn't look back. Walking out into the cold Boston air, I took my first deep breath of truly free air in years. It was over. I was finally free.